He had been on many recons, always successful, always very proud of what him and his troop was doing. And the very last one was, I don't know if I'm going to make it. Please say hello, like, to Eleanor for me. And that was it. And he died 4 or 5 days later after posting that.
I was on that ship when it blew up in '69. I got 28 dead one day, 300 all messed up. 6 people I knew got killed that day.
I can see their faces.
Monuments can tell us so much about the past. They exist as this very influential form of the built public history, so the creation in many ways of a narrative, and it articulates this individual social memory, but also simultaneously a collective memory. I think they're quite interesting because they do exist at the intersection of public history and also a more traditional academic history. As historians, we want to recognize that there's a history behind that history, if you will, and there are so many untold stories. And monuments can sometimes cover up those stories, but they can also open the door to uncover those previously unknown stories by individuals living in the present.
I'm CJ Scott. I'm a genealogist. My understanding is that there was 113 names when the install happened. We have 174 to date. We add names almost every year. Once we, obviously family members either reach out or the records become public, or they would just identify themselves at enlistment that their home of record was, for example, Detroit. Obviously back in that time as well, a lot of stuff was typed, transcription errors, because in some of those forms it would ask, are you a US citizen? And they would check off yes, when in fact they were not. But there are some that would identify, yes, I'm a Canadian, I'm not US citizen, and my hometown is Windsor, Ontario, or Toronto, or what have you. And at the time, I don't think anybody was tracking who was from where. They needed bodies, to be quite frank.
Canada has a law, we've had it since 1937, called the Foreign Enlistment Act, which makes it an offense, a punishable offense under Canadian law for a Canadian to serve in the military of another country, which is not an unfriendly country, those aren't the exact words, an unfriendly country in its relations with Canada. Okay. Interestingly, however, no one has ever been prosecuted under that law, under that 1937 law.
And then one day I took the good old tunnel bus. I went over to Detroit and I'm walking around, and I like to go to all these big buildings. And so I took the elevator in this one building. I wound up stepping out onto the floor where the recruiting stations are. And I thought, well, this is weird, right? Because they're all in the same floor, all next to each other, right? I said, oh, okay, I know what's up here. And I was gonna, go back to the elevator and, oh, wait a minute, don't go away. So I stayed and talked, and I said, well, he says, what would you like to do? I said, well, talking to one guy, he says, I always wanted to be a Marine. Well, at that time, the Marine recruiter had gone to lunch, but the Army recruiter was still there.
I just always wanted to go to sea. We used to see the ships go back and forth on the river, and I wanted to go to sea.
I think it was spontaneous. It just one day I thought, let me go try this. I was encouraged by the influence of my uncles, who had served in World War II, you know, and I was attracted to that kind of experience that they had.
My dad was a die maker and he was going over, and so we were always aware of what was happening on the American side of the border. And he worked with folks, many of whom had sons who were in Vietnam. I guess the thing that I remember more than anything else from those years was the nightly news. I mean the 11 o'clock news, 11 o'clock local news when that was a big thing. And it always started with the body count. It started with the body count. I forget whether I was watching ABC, NBC, CBS, the 3-channel universe, doesn't matter which one. I assume it was the same on all of them. And they would talk about the number of American casualties that day, and then the number of Viet Cong killed that day. And there was always something like, 5 to 25, 7 to 33, and it went on night after night, year after year, okay? And even a kid like me, I was mainly interested in the sports pages and that sort of thing. You'd ask yourself, well, why aren't we winning? Because we're kind of, educated to think of us versus them. It's the Cold War era and that sort of thing, And, they're experiencing these losses. They're hemorrhaging like crazy. We lose maybe 4 or 5 a day and so on and so forth. But we're still losing, or at least we're not winning, okay? So I think I remember that more than anything else.
They would ambush us because it was jungle, like triple canopy, and we'd walk right into them and never see them. Once they opened up, then you knew you were there.
The cargo that we were initially trained to handle was, general cargo, medical supplies, armaments, weapons, ammunition. And we even had to handle a chemical called Agent Orange. We had to wear masks when we had it. We had to wear masks, but again, we were just loading it and sending it out the airplane. Also, in some cases, when the circumstances were good, we would land, and if there were any deceased soldiers or Marines, we would take them in body bags. And a lot of those body bags, you just didn't know what was in them, but it was a very bloody experience for a 19, 20-year-old.
Oh, there's all kinds of things happen on a carrier. Yeah. I can rattle this stuff off for being on 3 full tours. I saw a whole bunch of stuff going on. How can you forget that? When you see a guy with half his head off and a big puddle of blood like that and all of his brain parts laying on the ground, yeah. Yeah, I always thought it was for survivor guilt, but I guess I got PTSD. That's what they tell me.
Helicopters flying by.
Really?
Yeah, I did a lot of combat flights, and that's a big trigger.
Still?
Yeah, you still look up there, and every time I can hear one coming in, think of one coming out, going out,
It still bothers me. I still have nightmares. I still have flashbacks of all that. I still do.
How we remember the past is not necessarily always history, and I think there can be a difference there. The past is many things, as is history, and sometimes they intersect and sometimes they're different. A student said this to me in my grad course once, and it really stuck with me. And we said we were trying to define what history is. I don't know actually if I have a good answer or not, but I'll borrow a crib from the student, and she said to me that history is a series of interlapping stories. And that stuck with me, because those stories individually are one thing. Bound together, we're not arguing here about the accuracy per se, but the perception. And I think wrapped together, we can put together a narrative and a conversation that represents multiple stories to tell a history of an event, of a space, of multiple groups of people in a historical context, both in an event that's being commemorated, but also the interworkings behind the erection of monuments and memorials and and entities that are built for public history.
I want everybody to know, especially in Canada, that there were guys, people that served in the Vietnam War in the U.S. military, either they had been drafted when they moved to the States or they enlisted. This actually happened, and it's a part of history for Canadians.
We had a battle with the city here that some council people thought no, because they're mercenaries. Well, all of a sudden, I think our blood pressure went sky high. Chris Reynolds was hooked up with a welding company in New Haven, where he's from. We all had our own superpowers, if you will. I hooked up with a granite company. I was a Southfield police officer at the time. And I talked to a gentleman there about what we got going. He said, yeah, no problem. We'll do what we can for you. And got the granite. Well, we got a hell of a deal on the granite, put it to you that way. Years old. They're just starting to live life. You know, they're starting to find out the goods and the bads. And what do? They go across that border and they join our military forces. Holy cow.
There is a connection between individuals on both sides of this border that is more strongly felt in a Windsor, Essex, Detroit context than there is at the national level, or more specifically perhaps in Ottawa as well. So the geographic space is so influential, and the individuals that inhabit that geographic space. And this monument is a representation of the way individuals engage over this international border. And I keep saying international border, I should say borderland space, because I don't want to overstate the existence of the nation or the nations in this conversation. I think it's a people-to-people relationship here, and there's a long history of that in this space.
Eventually, years later, I bought a house on the street and found out my neighbor was a Vietnam veteran. And then added to that, as we got more involved in the Vietnam veterans thing with the building of the memorial in Windsor, I found out that there was a fellow down the street a block away that served in Korea with the U.S. Army. And then there was another fellow over that served with about 3 blocks away that served U.S. Army in Vietnam. So I just began to realize, well, holy cow, there's more than that.
When I went to go home, they don't give you much money. When I went to go home, I had to go home by bus. So it was 4 days by bus to Detroit. But we were forbidden to wear our uniforms. We couldn't wear our uniforms. We couldn't wear because of the political attitude of people. And a lot of them were somewhat figuring that we're not good enough to wear a uniform representing the country that we were fighting for.
We weren't happy that people were protesting and everything back home when we were out there sweating our cans off, hanging our ass out there. Yeah, we weren't happy about it, but what are you going to do? That's just the way it is.
Some of them have said that they've been scorned as well, depending on where they were from and how close they lived to a border city. But for the most part, it was quiet, very quiet for them. And only because they kept it within the family unit. And in some cases, the families didn't know. You know, they didn't want to tell them about it because it wasn't a very good experience for them, which they thought it was going to be initially.
This memorial meant a lot to the 3 of us, of course. And it has made a lot of people recognize those men on the wall.
3 guys come into my office about 30 years ago. Rick Gidner, Eddie Johnson, Chris Reynolds. They come with this idea of a monument to express their gratitude to the Canadian young men who went to Vietnam and made the supreme sacrifice. Their presentation was so sincere, it was so from the heart, it was so moving. One couldn't do other than simply say, count me in. What do we do?
The fact that the municipality took a leadership role here 30 years ago, good for us. It just speaks to the importance that we put as a community into the service of our veterans, and Vietnam is no different. The construction of this monument 30 years ago was really a collaborative effort between a Michigan group and, of course, the city of Windsor and many veterans here locally. And just by virtue of the nature of the Vietnam War, there is that deep connection between the U.S. and Canada, which is somewhat unique with respect to the other monuments that we have. It's nice to have Americans, Canadians gather in one spot and reflect on the fact that Canada has never been an idle bystander. We have always been allies, we have always been partners, and we've always fought together with our friends in the United States.
My name is Tom Sharkey. I went into the U.S. Army in 1967. I was living in Toronto. I'm a third-generation Torontonian. And I come from an era where my grandfather fought with the Canadian Army in World War I, father fought with the Canadian forces in World War II, and that was the generation I came from. And, so military was pretty well normal. I went to 173rd Airborne, volunteered for the Rangers, got accepted, went to training, Ranger School in Ankei, and I served basically as a Ranger team leader for almost 2 tours, 69, 70. Our primary role was gather intelligence through ambush. We worked in 6-man teams. We went in enemy-occupied areas, we stealthed in, and we'd ambush them and gather intelligence from what we found from the ambush. That was our primary function. Since we hardly ever talk about it, it's kind of nice to get back together with people who had the same experience. And being a Canadian, there aren't a lot of people with that experience. Like a whole generation of Americans got drafted, or Canada, there's very few. I only knew of 3 other people who served in the American forces in Vietnam. So to me, this is wonderful. I get to see a lot of Canadians who shared the same experience, and it's kind of very cathartic, quite frankly.
My name is Lisa Aiken. I'm from Guelph, Ontario. My uncle is Calvin Nesbitt. He also from Guelph, and he was killed in action in Vietnam. I published his letters because they were just so impactful. I did it more for therapy and then to see if anyone else found them as interesting as I did. And the people that in my community that went to high school with him, like just seeing their interest and every one of them wondering, we always wondered what happened to him. We knew in high school he left, and we knew that he didn't come back, but they wanted that gap filled. And so the book just filled that gap for them, and I saw how much, they were healing from it. And of course, they wanted to come to the door to pick the book up, and they wanted to talk, and they brought photos, and they brought stories, and they brought anecdotes. And I'm just like, holy crap. I had people coming from, a couple cities over, because they just heard through the grapevine. And that to me was just the pinnacle of healing. You have to have something tangible there that people can come, people can see. I can go, the first thing I did, that's my uncle. There's a sense of pride seeing it and seeing it being celebrated and honored.